Aboragani, and welcome to Ilana Monet's Motivational Moment. Before I start, I must do my salutations. Aboragani. Assalamu alaikum. Ikaro. Now that I've done my salutations, let's get into the meat of the message for today. As you know, we are talking about the African American history before 1865, and we're building our way up. We went from where we were in Africa, how the slave trade began with Christopher Columbus and other explorers till now. So now the colonial African American experience was marked by a brutal institution of slavery, which began in 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to Jamestown, Virginia. Over time, slave codes were enacted, legally defining slaves as property and stripping them of their basic rights. Despite harsh conditions and oppressions, enslaved African Americans developed a distinct culture blending Africa and European elements. They resisted their oppressor through various means, from everyday acts of defiance to open rebellion, which maintained strong community bonds and cultural trades. Now we're going to talk about the key elements and a timeline. Okay. In 1619, the African American slaves arrived to Jamestown, Virginia, marking the beginning of slavery in the British North American colonies. In 1940, the Slave Code began to enact in the colonies, legally defining the status of slaves and the rights of the slave owners. In 1661, Virginia legally recognized slaves. In 1662, Virginia's law stated children born to enslaved mothers were also slaves. 1676, Bacon Rebellion in Virginia united poor whites and blacks against the planters' elites, leading to a harsher slave code. 1705, Virginia slave codes defined slaves as real estate and made it legal for slaves to be property or weapons. In 1739, Sorrento Rebellion in South Carolina was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies. 1775 through 1783, the American Revolution saw many slaves fighting for their freedom, with some slaveholders freeing their slaves. In 1808, the United States banned the international slave trade, but domestic slave trade continued. So even though they banned it from Africa, they could no longer bring slaves from Africa. The United States had already come up with a plan. And they were called breeding plantations, where they will put the men with different women to breed, depending on how their bill was, how their pedigree was. So with the black man leaving or uprooting or going, I think that is a product of slavery. Now let's get to the social structures and the hierarchy. Colonial society was hierarchy with wealthy white landowners and merchants at the top and the enslaved Africans at the bottom. Now, when we talk about the wealthy white landowners, that was all white men. Women did not have any rights. It was white man, white woman, black man, black woman. So the black woman was at the bottom all the time. Among slaves, there was a hierarchy based on skin color and occupation. The lighter skinned slaves and those especially skilled in carpentry often held higher statuses and better living conditions. Light skin, you in, dark skin, get back. They used to do this paper bag test. And if you were light like the paper bag, you were good. But if you were darker than the paper bag, then you were considered less than. Field slaves had the lowest status, performing the most physical and demanding labor. House slaves had more direct contact with white owners and somewhat better living conditions, but were subject to more control and abuse. Some free blacks existed, but faced legal and social discrimination. Free blacks in the North had more opportunities than they did in the South. Hmm. Hmm. Micro generation between white men and white women resulted in mixed race populations, but these children were still considered slaves. Why? Because they were born to an African woman. They take the lineage of the mother. Now, labor and economic systems. Slave labor was the foundation of the southern colonial economy, particularly in agriculture, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Slave working long hours under harsh conditions with consistent threat of physical treatment or punishment. Skilled workers or skilled slave workers like blacksmiths and coopers were the agricultural laborers. But most of them were agricultural laborers. Slave owners extracted as much labor as possible to maximize their profits. Domestic slave trade extended as demanding of a labor group, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Now, the invention of the cotton gin was actually invented by a black man who wanted to make cotton picking a little bit easier. But what it did was it became a tool for the Anglo-Saxons at that time, or the Europeans at that time, to mass produce. Therefore, when you are mass producing, you need someone to manhand or handle the cotton gin, which causes us to have more laborers. Slave breeding became common to replenish the labor forces as the international slave trade ended. Like I told you before, what they did was they would take slave men who were bound, who were what they thought were the top part of slavery, and they would breed them with women that they thought would be a good suit for them. There's possibly having a baby that had all the attributes that they were looking for. Okay, in 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans were enslaved, representing a huge economic investment for Southern slave owners. Now, let's talk about the cultural practices and traditions. Despite the hardship of slavery, African Americans developed a distinct cultural blending African and European elements. Music was an important part of the slavery culture and spiritual expressing both sorrow and hope. The call and response style and rhythmic complex reflects African musical traditions, or traditions such as storytelling, folk tales, the proverbs that taught lessons and preserved history. Religion played a central role in slave communities, with blending of Christian and African spiritual practices. Slaves often held secret religious meetings away from the white control. Family was important to slaves, though the families were often separated by cell. Extended kin networks and fictional kin helped provide support. Like my cousin, that's not really my cousin, we're cousin not by blood. Naming practices reflect the African American history and family connections. Now let's talk about the rebellion. Slaves resist their oppression in various ways. In small everyday acts, the open rebellions like running away was a common way of resistance. While slaves freed from their plantation of the north, to the north, they were forming maroon communities in remote areas. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad helped many slaves escape to freedom. Slowdowns, illness, and breaking tools were ways that slaves could undermine productivities. Revolts were rare but occurring, often being brutally suppressed. The New York City Conspiracy of 1741 and the Gabriel Rebellion in 1800s. Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, Virginia was the bloodiest, leading to stricter slave laws. Just a quick tidbit. With the Nat Turner Rebellion, when they killed Nat Turner, they took his skin and made purses, shoes. They even ate the man. thinking that if they engulfed some of him, they will have some of his power. So even though they couldn't just kill Nat Turner, they had to take parts of his body as souvenirs. Slaves are an oppression to the white domination. Now the legal and the restriction, the legal statuses and restrictions. Slaves had no legal rights and were considered property under the law. Close slave codes regulate every aspect of the slaves' lives and gave masters complete control. Slaves could not marry, not legally. They could not own property, learn how to read or write, or testify in the court against whites. Punishments for infractions were severe, including whipping, branding, and mutilation. Even free blacks faced legal discrimination and could be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Remember 13 years a slave? As slavery expanded, laws became harsher. Slaves could not be taught how to read or to write. And then freeing slaves became more difficult over time, with some states requiring free slaves to leave the state. The Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 and 1850 made it easier for slaves to be captured and returned to their owners, even if they had free status. Now, the daily living and living conditions of the African slaves' living conditions were generally harsh, with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Housing was often crude cabins with dirt floors and little furniture or privacy. Diet consisted mostly of pork and cornmeal, with some vegetables grown in a small plot by the slaves. Clothing was manual and often were made from rough materials like burlap. Working conditions were severe, long hours, and constant supervision by overseers, micromanaging. Slaves were subject to physical and sexual abuse by masters and overseers. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the term called buck breaking. And that's when they would take the strongest, biggest slave, and the men from other slave plantations will all get together and they would rape that man constantly in front of slaves so that they could show or to take away the power of that slave. They will let them know that you are not a man, that you are merely a property, that we could do whatever we want to you. And they would do this days and days and have multiple people rape this man, sodomize this man in front of his wife, kids. It didn't even matter. Family separation was common as slaves were sold away from loved ones. Despite the hardships, slaves created a sense of community and found ways to resist dehumanization. Religion, music, and storytelling provided a solitary and a hope. Strong social bonds and networks of mutual aid helped slaves survive. The legacy and the importance of future generations. The legacy of slaves continues to shape American societies and the racial relations. Economic impact of slavery was huge, with unpaid labor and building of wealth from white Americans. Disparities in wealth and opportunities became black and white Americans can trace back to slavery. Racism and discrimination against African Americans have those roots in the ideology of white supremacy used to justify slavery, which they did have African or a black Bible, and in the black Bible they took out a lot of our Bible that we have today, which was the King James Version at that time. They took a lot out of the Bible to help them keep us in line, as if God was the one who said all of this. Racism and discrimination among African Americans and their roots in the ideology of white supremacy used to justify slavery. African American culture and identifying were forged in the critical of slavery. Resistance, creativity, and resilience in face of opposition are key themes. Political debates over slavery, like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, led to the Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Missouri Compromise said that Africans who were born or brought to Missouri, that was considered a slave state. Illinois was introduced to the colony or into the Americas as a non-slave state, but Louisiana and several others had to be slave states. Reconstructioning amendments like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment aimed to gain legal equality for African Americans but faced resistance. The Jim Crow laws and segregations among the oppression African Americans long after slavery ended. Civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s fought against ongoing criticism and racism. Ongoing struggles for the racial justice, equality, Black Lives Matter, shows the continued impact of slavery and racism in America. Which says to me that even though America has gone so far, there are still people who have this keening neck or this feeling that they are better than African Americans, that they are divinely instructed to hold African Americans down, that they have a right to put your foot on their necks, like George Floyd. Like Stephanie Bland. There are many African Americans who resisted, who were in a part of the resistance, who were killed, especially when the the Ferguson uprising. A lot of the African Americans that took a stand for that they were found dead, and their deaths were labeled as suicides or unexplainable deaths, which leads me to believe that there were some other underlining things that happened to edify or to have that to happen to those people who were a part of that. So with that being said, guys, I have got to go. I love you, but God loves you more. And remember, I'll see you at the top because the bottom is way too crowded. Just a little tidbit before I leave. All of my videos can be found on YouTube under Yolanda Monet. So go and check me out on YouTube. I have a lot of other stories. I have a lot of other things posted so that you can see them. And with that being said, bye, guys.